The small town of Ravenwood was a quiet place, known for its foggy nights and ancient folklore. Among its many legends was one that parents shared in whispers to keep their children from wandering at night. The story of the midnight visitor. People said he was a shadowy figure who appeared only on mist-filled nights, moving silently from house to house. Some claimed that if you saw him, you'd be marked forever. The legend went that the midnight visitor would leave a mysterious silver key, and once you touched it, he'd return to your home again and again until he got what he wanted. Hannah had grown up hearing this story, like everyone else in Ravenwood. But as an adult, she dismissed it as a silly ghost story, until the night she became part of it. It was a late, misty night in early November. Hannah had stayed up to finish some work, the sound of the ticking clock her only company. As she leaned back, stretching, she glanced at the clock, 11:57 p.m., almost midnight. She decided to finish up and go to bed, but just as she was about to turn off her lamp, a faint tapping broke the silence. It was a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 coming from the window across the room. Her heart skipped a beat. She told herself it was probably a branch scraping against the glass, yet a strange chill ran down her spine. She got up slowly, her footsteps muffled on the carpet, and approached the window. As she neared, the tapping stopped. Hannah peered out, her breath fogging the glass. At first, all she saw was the thick fog blanketing her backyard, swirling in the dim light from the street lamp. But then, as if forming out of the mist itself, a tall, shadowy figure appeared. He was dressed in an old-fashioned, dark overcoat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide, battered hat. Hannah's breath hitched as the figure's head turned slowly, facing her window. She felt an intense gaze, cold and penetrating, though his face was completely obscured. The figure raised a long, bony finger and tapped on the glass 3 times, each tap sending a shiver through her body. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small silver key. He pressed it against the window, his empty gaze locked onto her. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream as the figure slowly faded into the mist, leaving only a faint impression of his form and the eerie feeling that he was still watching. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, pacing her room, heart racing, wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing. As dawn broke, she cautiously approached the window. To her horror, lying on the outside ledge was the silver key, cold and gleaming in the morning light. Against her better judgment, Hannah picked it up. It was heavy, old-fashioned, and engraved with strange symbols she didn't recognize. As her fingers wrapped around it, she felt a strange, icy tingling. She quickly threw it into a drawer, hoping that would be the end of it. But that night, just as the clock struck midnight, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was her imagination. But the taps grew louder, a steady, relentless rhythm. Finally, unable to resist, she glanced out the window again. The midnight visitor was back. This time, he was closer, standing just outside her front door. His face remained shrouded, but she could feel his gaze piercing through her, as if waiting for her to open the door. She grabbed her phone to call the police, but when she looked back, he was gone. The next day, she visited the town's oldest resident, Mrs. Alder, who was known for her knowledge of local lore. When Hannah described the figure and the silver key, Mrs. Alder's face grew pale. "You've been marked," Mrs. Alder whispered, clutching her own hands. "He leaves that key for those he intends to return to. And once you touch it, he'll keep coming back until you give him what he wants." "What does he want?" Hannah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No one knows," Mrs. Alder replied. "Those who saw him, they eventually disappeared. The legend says he's looking for something, someone, maybe someone lost in his time. But if you don't find a way to break his mark, he'll keep haunting you until he takes you." Desperate, Hannah returned home, locking every door and window, hoping somehow to ward off the midnight visitor. She buried the key in the backyard, deep beneath the old oak tree, praying that would be enough. But as the clock struck midnight that evening, the tapping returned, louder and more forceful. This time, it wasn't just at her window. It was at her front door, her bedroom window, and even on the walls of her home. She could hear it all around her, relentless, insistent, as though the visitor were everywhere. Then, silence. Hannah held her breath, listening. She dared to believe it was over, but then a chilling voice drifted through the stillness. Barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "You took the key. Now you are mine." The figure materialized at the foot of her bed, standing unnaturally still, his head tilted as though studying her. Hannah froze, unable to move, unable to scream. He reached out a hand, long fingers extending toward her, and pressed something cold into her palm, the silver key. The next morning, her neighbors found her house empty, every door and window locked from the inside. No sign of struggle, no indication of where she had gone. All that remained was the silver key, lying on her bedside table, untouched, yet cold as ice. To this day, the people of Ravenwood say that if you hear tapping at midnight, don't look, and whatever you do, never touch the key.